The prophets have been doing their job. Their job is to speak for God into the realities of life. The call of the prophets is to speak God's truth into what is, regardless of the consequences. We know that they are rejected roundly, in some cases stoned to death in people's rejection of the truth that they have to tell. But they tell it anyway, and they tell it with conviction, and they do so against these threats of violence and worse. Jesus talks about Jerusalem in his time as emblematic of the whole history of God with the people. But he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who murdered the prophets and stoned those who were sent to you." And then in the next breath, this beautiful maternal image that we've talked about. "How I've longed to gather you like a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not have it." The prophetic message is rejected because it threatens the status quo. Purely and simply, it challenges what is to become what could be. And there is, it seems, a natural resistance to change, and a resistance and a rejection out of hand of people that might come and have the arrogance to tell us that maybe we need to change. And this has been our history with prophets. When we look at this, at the prophetic cycle, which we've kind of been exploring in this series, I think of it more as a prophetic symphony, because it has very distinct movements to it. And the first movement in the prophetic symphony is this time of warning, of calling people to account for the reality of life as it's experienced by everyone, not just them. It's a challenge to people to understand how far it may be that they've separated themselves from God, which is really our definition of sin. Hamartia, the Greek word, means to miss the mark. Paul says, all have sinned and fallen short. All have become separated, distanced from the center of goodness that is God. So prophets challenge us that things that are not God have been put in God's place in life, our definition of idolatry. People have become separated, distanced from God, our definition of sin. And they call people to this, to attention to this, to look at this and see what it is and what it means. When we look at the prophecy of Isaiah, which is sometimes called the gospel of the Old Testament. The prophecy of Isaiah really frames this idea of the movements of this prophetic symphony. In the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, more than half the book, is devoted to this first movement, the warning. Watch out, because look where this is likely to lead. Prophets are not fortune tellers. People go to soothsayers and astrologers to get their fortunes told in Jesus' time and before. Prophets are people who speak the truth of God no matter where it leads. And they look to a people that have distanced themselves from God and point to where that's likely to lead, to disaster, destruction, death. So it's a warning for their own good. But the first 39 chapters of Isaiah are Isaiah warning the people that the path they're walking leads to their doom. And that ushers in the second movement in the symphony of this prophetic cycle, and that is the consequences themselves. Because rejecting the prophets out of hand far too often, what they have warned about comes to pass. And so we have the middle section of Isaiah's prophecy, which talks about exile, which talks about divided people and divided kingdoms and the vulnerability of division and the way warring empires come in and take them over and oppress them and take them away in exile. The consequences that the prophets have warned about now bear fruit. But the interesting thing about the prophets is, as tempting as it might be, they don't second guess everyone and say, told you, warned you all about this. Look, exactly what I warned you about is precisely what has happened. I told you time and again. They don't do that. nor do they abandon or reject the people at their deepest point of need. It has all come down on top of them. They are in exile from the place God promised them. They are now abjectly distanced from God and despairing as to whether or not they might ever be able to be reconciled. And in that time, the prophets don't reject them, maybe because they're most open to hear when they're at the bottom of the cycle. A modern analog to this, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German Lutheran theologian, professor, teacher, pastor, during the rise of the National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, and moving in through the 20s into the early 30s, Bonhoeffer begins to criticize this clearly fascist movement. And he begins to resist it in the church. He resists it in the seminary where he's teaching. He resists it in the pulpit where he's preaching. And he calls attention to himself, and he creates a danger for himself. Prophets do. To the point that he, in 1933, accepts an invitation from a friend of his, Reinhold Niebuhr, at Union Theological Seminary in the United States to come as a visiting professor and teacher. And he does this. He leaves Germany. It's dangerous for him to stay. But a few years later, he does something astounding. He goes back. He goes back to a place where he is literally under threat of arrest or worse. And he goes back to this place where this specter is growing in force and power. And he says this to Niebuhr. He writes to Reinhold and he says, "I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war that is most surely coming, if I do not share the trials of this time with my people." The prophets don't reject, and they don't second guess, and they don't wag their fingers in people's faces at the bottom of the cycle in the second movement of this prophetic symphony. They begin to offer a new voice. They begin to understand a new role for themselves. They begin to feel a new inspiration and an abiding truth from God that says prophets don't reject because God doesn't reject. And even at the bottom of the cycle, God is vitally present. And so the little birds that begin to sing in the hearts of the prophets inspire them to offer voices of hope. And here comes that word. The character of the second movement moving into the third movement is hope itself. That it is not a time for despair. That this is not a forever condition of separation from God, but one from which God can redeem us, as God only can. And so they begin to sing a hopefulness. Even before the war took place, Bonhoeffer was looking at the aftermath and the opportunities to rebuild when he believed wholeheartedly, when hope told him that these forces of destruction would ultimately be defeated. He goes back to be with people in the midst of that travail so that he has a legitimate place among them as they begin to rebuild in the aftermath. And he does so at his own peril. Tragically, he is arrested after a time, and he's taken from prison to Flossenburg concentration camp. And in April of 1945, the Nazis execute him 2 weeks before Flossenburg would be liberated by the Allies, an effort that they knew full well was coming. And so they killed him. Prophets, to the extent of their own life, stay true to the truth that God seeks to convey through them. And in the midst of despair, a voice of hope is like a ray of sunshine. We hear the third movement in Isaiah's prophecy. Arise, shine in the midst of exile. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Not will, has risen on you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. Sounds like World War II to me. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. The prophets speaking for God begin to give forth with a song of hope. Tikva in Hebrew. And elepedos in Greek, and every language and culture has a word for this, and they all mean exactly the same thing. The desire for a good that is born with the expectation of its fulfillment. The longing for a good that can come, and the certainty that it will appear. That's hope. And so, the prophets proclaim this. And it's not, hey, it's going to be all right. Hey, things will work out. They always do. Absolutely not. It's pragmatic. And it's potent for that reason. The voice that the hope that the prophets give voice to is that at the bottom, God has always been faithful to raise up deliverers, prophets, and leaders from among our own people and to lead us into a new day. God has always been faithful to do this. And so our hope is based not in our own faithfulness, but in God's faithfulness, proven throughout the history of our relationship with God. God has always been faithful to raise up truth tellers and leaders to guide us out of the ditch and back onto the path. In light of and in respect of our own faithlessness, God remains faithful. And it is God that reconciles, redeems, and delivers. Arise and shine, for your light has come. Take heart in times like these. God will raise up one from among you, like me, Moses says. Listen to him. In our Matthew Gospel today, this is Jesus' role as prophet. Here is my servant, quoting from Isaiah in the Gospel of Matthew. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him. He'll proclaim justice to the nations. He leads justice to victory. In his name will the nations put their hope. That's Jesus' role, the fulfillment of the prophecy in his own time. Peter tells us we should always be ready to share about the hope that is within us. The little thing with feathers that flutters in our hearts. We should always be ready to testify to the hope that is within us. Because if not us, then whom? If the people of faith will not stand up and speak God's truth about God's faithfulness and God's reconciliation and redemption, then who will? In a world in which we are nested, that seems to be becoming more secular and more cynical by the day. We see it in our political processes. We see it in our institutional declines. We see it in the decline in participation in religious gatherings overall. If not us, then who will stand and proclaim God's truth? That it is in community that we find our strength, in community that God is present with us, and in community that God leads us forward into these new days. We are called to be people of hope. Jeremiah, another of the major prophets from our first reading today, speaking for God. God says, I know the plans I have for you. Plans not for your harm, but for your good. Plans for a future with hope. We sing it in our songs. We're doing songs of change on Lent Wednesdays. And we need a lot more Lent Wednesdays because we've got a lot more songs that we could do. We're getting encouragements about songs all the time. And I'm remembering a song by Mason Prophet. Any Mason Prophet fans in here from years gone by, about 1969, 1970? I'm dating myself again, which I seem to be doing with alarming frequency these days. But we learned these songs when I was a kid in junior high. We started singing these songs by groups like this, the Hippies. Hope for a world of loving. Hope for a time of giving. Hope is a word worth living. Let's live it together. That's a refrain from one of their songs. We need to be singing these songs. Songs of encouragement and hopefulness. We have it in our hymnody. It's not our faithfulness that delivers us, but God's faithfulness by which we are delivered. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Strength for today, bright hope for tomorrow. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Amen.
If you have a prayer request card, please pass those to the center aisle as we sing our next hymn, number